December 5th. Winter had arrived in many American cities. Children threw their first snowballs, shops decorated their windows with fairy lights, and the anticipation of Christmas was in the air. But in a quiet suburb of Merced, California, there was no festive mood in the Stainer family. For them, this day was not part of the magic of Advent. It was the day their world began to crumble. For on that day, they realized that they might never see their son again. On the morning of December 4th, 1972, 7-year-old Stephen Stainer left the house as usual to go to school. He was carrying a backpack that seemed almost too big for his petite frame and waved goodbye to his mother. No one knew that this would be their last goodbye, at least for many years. When Stephen did not return home that afternoon, a nightmare began for the family that seemed to have no end. The police were notified, neighbors questioned each other, and soon flyers with the missing boy's picture were posted all over Merced. But every lead came to nothing. It seemed as if Stephen had been swallowed up by the earth. While his parents, Delbert and Kay, clung to every straw, his older brother Carrie, then 11 years old, began to quietly withdraw from reality. To the public, Stephen was now one of many missing children. To his family, he was everything. No one suspected that the little boy was being held captive just a few miles away in a remote cabin, not by a stranger, but by a man with a specific plan who had put on a mask of kindness. While Christmas lights twinkled outside, Stephen began years of torment in the care of a man who claimed to be his new guardian. And while Stephen longed to return home, something else grew inside his brother Carrie. A feeling of invisibility, of being overlooked, which would soon develop a sinister momentum of its own. Stephen was still a child when he began to memorize a new name, one that had not been given to him, but forced upon him. Dennis Parnell. That was the name given to him by the man who had approached him on December 4th with a mixture of false sympathy and perfidious calculation. Kenneth Parnell. A seemingly harmless older man with thinning hair and a quiet voice, who claimed to be an employee of a religious organization and said that Stephen's parents no longer wanted him. It was a lie, so carefully crafted that it sounded believable to a 7-year-old child. Parnell had not acted alone. A teenage accomplice, Edward Murphy, had helped lure Stephen into the car. But only Parnell knew what would really follow. A new life under a false identity in a remote house far away from Merced. There he began to systematically manipulate Stephen. He gave him gifts, promised him freedom, called him son, and at the same time set in motion a perfidious system of control, fear, and abuse. While the media published initial reports about the missing boy, Parnell tried to cover his tracks. He dyed Stephen's hair, didn't enroll him in school, and moved him to different places. To the outside world, the new boy at his side was simply a late-adopted son. No one asked any questions, and Stephen, he was confused, overwhelmed, but also dependent, because Parnell was the only one he had left. And so Stephen began to live the lie. Meanwhile, life did not return to normal for the Stainer family. The children's room remained untouched. The bicycle still stood against the wall. Carrie, the big brother, began to change. He hardly spoke about Stephen anymore. Instead, he withdrew into himself, drawing in his notebook for hours and watching animals in the garden with an almost eerie fixation. His parents understood their son's quiet behavior, but no one suspected that a shadow was already growing inside Carrie that would take root deeper than anyone could have imagined. The years passed. 7-year-old Stephen became a teenager who hardly knew who he really was. In public, he called himself Dennis, but deep down he remained Stephen. A child who was missing, who was being searched for, but who could hardly find himself. Parnell moved him halfway across California, sometimes living in trailers, sometimes in cheap motels or remote houses. Never for long. Never anywhere where anyone asked too many questions. Parnell left Stephen alone when he didn't complain, and resorted to control and violence when the boy rebelled. He never sent him to school, forbade him to have contact with other children his age, and didn't let him write letters. And yet Stephen tried as best he could to create a semblance of normality. He took care of pets, helped neighbors carry groceries, and learned how to do minor repairs. Outsiders thought he was a shy but polite child. No one had any idea what kind of life he was living, or that his father wasn't really his father. At the same time, Carrie was also changing. The years without Stephen were like an endless noise to him. He became calmer, quieter, but inside a storm was raging. He developed compulsive rituals, began to suffer from depression, and withdrew completely. At school, he was considered a loner with dark thoughts. His classmates kept their distance. His teachers tried to intervene, unsuccessfully. His brother's disappearance had left a deep wound that grew deeper with each passing year. The family tried to stick together. Christmas was celebrated every year, but it was never the same again. Every gift under the tree was overshadowed by Stephen's absence. Every empty place at the table was a reminder of what had been lost. Hope faded, but it did not die. His parents never gave up. And Stephen, he slowly began to realize that what he was experiencing was not normal, that what was being done to him was wrong. But he didn't know how to escape, because his life was a prison without bars but with walls. With each passing year, Stephen grew older, and Parnell grew more restless. The boy he had once been able to control was becoming independent, asking questions, arguing. Stephen was now almost 14 years old, too big, too loud, too visible. It became clear to Parnell that if he wanted to maintain control, he needed a new child, one who was still malleable, even more innocent, even more dependent. And so he began to pressure Stephen. He demanded that he kidnap children himself, a perfidious step intended to show how far his manipulation went. But Stephen refused, again and again, so often that Parnell finally hired someone else, a teenager named Sean, whom Parnell treated as a friend. In February 1980, they kidnapped 5-year-old Timothy White on his way home from school. Stephen couldn't take it anymore. He saw himself in Timothy, a little boy full of fear, full of questions, crying for his mother. That night, while Parnell was asleep, Stephen made a decision. He would escape. Not for himself, for Timothy. Maybe for both of them. On March 1st, 1980, they seized an opportunity. Stephen took Timothy by the hand, left the remote house in Ukiah, and searched for help for hours. Finally, they reached a police station in town. When the officer asked him who he was, he replied hesitantly, "I think my name is Stephen Stainer." In Merced, this call meant the return of a ghost. For 7 years, Delbert and Kay had lived between hope and despair. Now their son was back. The media pounced on the story. A hero, a survivor, a boy who had not been broken. But behind the heroic narrative lay another pain. Who was Stephen now? And what had become of the boy who had left the house on December 4th? Carrie watched his brother's return in silence. The media focused their cameras on Stephen, interviewed him, turned him into a symbol, while Carrie stood in the shadows, as so often before. And something solidified inside him, a feeling of not being seen, not heard, not important. It was the quiet, dangerous beginning of a completely different development. Stephen was home, physically at least, but the child who had left 7 years earlier no longer existed. In his place stood a teenager with scars that no one could see. But that resonated in every sentence, every glance, every silence. The family tried to return to normalcy. But what does normalcy look like when 7 years are missing? Stephen had difficulty adjusting. School was a challenge, not only because of the material he had never learned, but also because of the looks he got. Classmates either admired him or avoided him, and teachers treated him like a delicate object. At home, everything was familiar, but strange. His childhood bedroom was smaller than he remembered. The furniture was still there, but he no longer fit in. He started smoking, drinking, and got into trouble with the law. Nothing serious, but enough to worry his parents. Stephen struggled with his identity. Was he a victim? A hero? A normal teenager? None of it felt right. In interviews, he often downplayed his experiences. He didn't want to be seen as the boy who was stolen. He wanted to be seen as someone who had returned. Carrie watched it all, silently. While the world talked about Stephen, Carrie became more and more withdrawn. In his room, he collected newspaper clippings, scribbled dark sketches in his notebooks, and read about serial killers. He developed a fascination with violence that he never showed to anyone, perhaps because it promised him power in a world where he felt powerless. The family recognized the imbalance but didn't know how to address it. The attention Stephen received was understandable, but it made Carrie invisible, and that feeling gnawed at him, year after year, like a slow poison eating away at every pore of his mind. Stephen seemed to build a life of his own over time. He married at 20, became the father of 2 children, and worked as a laborer. He rarely spoke about his years at Parnell, almost never about what he had to endure there. But the scars remained, in his behavior, in his nightmares, in his need to please others, and at the same time never really feel like he belonged. In 1991, Stephen Stainer died in a motorcycle accident at the age of only 24. The public was shocked. Newspapers reprinted his photo, recalling the kidnapping and his return. Many saw him as a tragic figure, but for his family, it was more, a second, final loss. Carrie Stainer was 30 years old at the time, quiet, polite, unassuming. Outwardly, he never seemed to have fully emerged from his brother's shadow. But inside, something else had been brewing for a long time. A dark obsession, fueled by years of rejection, loneliness, and pent-up anger. In 1999, Carrie struck. In a national park in California, he brutally murdered a young woman and 2 female tourists. Just weeks later, he confessed to the murders and revealed that he had been fantasizing about killing for years. The media once again descended on the Stainer family. 2 brothers, 2 extremes, one a victim who became a symbol of survival, the other a perpetrator who became the epitome of the incomprehensible. The story of the Stainer brothers became a tragic allegory for the damage that trauma can cause, not only to those who suffer it, but also to those who appear to be in the background. Because in reality, Stephen's kidnapping had changed the lives of the entire family forever. When the Christmas lights came back on in Merced on December 5th, hardly anyone remembered the day it all began, the first day without Stephen. But for the Stainer family, that day was forever marked by a deep divide, a point at which normal life came to an abrupt end and was replaced by years of pain. Stephen had left and come back, only to be lost forever. Carrie had stayed, but drifted further and further away inside. 2 brothers who became victims in completely different ways, one through violence, the other through silence and invisibility. What would have happened if Stephen had never been kidnapped? Would Carrie have led a different life? Would he ever have committed murder? Or was the darkness inside him independent of what happened to his brother? Questions that remain unanswered, but leave a bitter echo.